Picture this. It's 1975, the school bell rings for break time, and 30 children charge into the playground shouting, "British Bulldog." Within minutes, half of them are on the ground, the other half are cheering, and the teacher is having a cigarette by the window, completely unbothered. Today, that same scene would trigger emergency calls, safeguarding investigations, and probably criminal charges. We're diving into 10 playground games from 1950s, 1980s Britain that were considered normal childhood fun, but would land modern parents in serious trouble with the authorities. Number 1. British Bulldog. Let's start with the king of playground chaos, British Bulldog. This wasn't just a game, it was gladiatorial combat disguised as children's entertainment. One child stood in the middle of the playground while everyone else lined up at opposite ends. The goal? Sprint across without being caught and brought to the ground. The rules were beautifully simple and terrifyingly dangerous. The person in the middle had to physically stop runners by any means necessary, tackling, grabbing, wrestling them to the concrete until they couldn't move. Once caught, you joined the middle team until only one runner remained. What made this game legendary wasn't the strategy or skill, it was the sheer physical chaos. 30 children charging at full speed, colliding in the middle, with the strongest kids acting as human roadblocks. The playground would echo with the sound of bodies hitting tarmac and the cheers of spectators. Teachers knew exactly what was happening and simply turned a blind eye. It was considered character building, teaching children about courage, determination, and how to take a knock. The occasional trip to the school nurse was just part of the learning experience. Can you imagine explaining British Bulldog to a modern head teacher? The very mention would probably trigger a full risk assessment, insurance review, and possibly a call to social services. We've gained safety, but lost that raw test of playground courage. By the 1980s, most schools had quietly banned it, though children continued playing unofficial versions whenever adults weren't watching. Did you ever play British Bulldog? And were you brave enough to be the last runner? Number 2. Conkers. Here's a game that sounds innocent until you realize it involved children swinging rock-hard projectiles at each other's hands with considerable force. Conkers wasn't just about smashing horse chestnuts, it was about the elaborate preparation, the underground economy, and the genuine risk of serious harm. The preparation was half the fun and completely against school rules. Children would bake conkers in ovens, soak them in vinegar for weeks, or even coat them in nail varnish to create virtually indestructible weapons. These hardened conkers were traded like contraband, with legendary specimens passed down through playground generations. The game itself was deceptively violent. You'd take turns swinging your conker at your opponents, aiming to smash theirs to pieces. But with children's aim being what it was, hands, knuckles, and occasionally faces took the brunt of the impact. The string would whip around, creating welts and cuts that we wore like battle scars. Schools tried to ban the hardening process, but children were remarkably creative. Secret conker preparation became an underground art form, with families inadvertently becoming accomplices by allowing their ovens to be used for cooking ammunition. The psychological element was crucial too. Facing a legendary 20-er conker, one that had destroyed 20 others, required genuine courage. The anticipation of pain was almost worse than the actual impact, but backing down meant playground humiliation. Modern health and safety would have a field day with conkers, sharp objects, projectiles, deliberate targeting of hands. It ticks every box on the absolutely not list. What was your highest scoring conker, and how did you prepare it? Number 3. Kiss Chase. Here's a game that would have modern safeguarding officers reaching for their incident report forms. Kiss Chase was exactly what it sounds like. Children chasing each other around the playground with the explicit goal of forcing unwanted physical contact. What was once considered innocent playground romance is now recognized as something far more problematic. The rules varied by school, but the basic premise remained the same. Usually boys would chase girls, though sometimes it was reversed, with the goal of cornering them and planting a kiss, willing or not. The victims would run, hide and scream, but participation was somehow expected rather than optional. What made this particularly uncomfortable in hindsight was the power dynamics involved. Faster, stronger children could essentially force physical contact on anyone they chose, while slower or smaller children had little recourse, except to hide or hope a teacher would intervene, which they rarely did. The game created a playground hierarchy based on desirability and physical capability. Some children were targeted constantly, others never at all, and the social implications lasted far beyond break time. It was an early introduction to concepts of consent, power, and bodily autonomy, except nobody called it that. Teachers generally viewed kiss chase as harmless fun, a natural part of growing up and learning about relationships. The idea that children might not want to participate or that forced physical contact might be inappropriate simply wasn't part of the conversation. Try explaining kiss chase to a modern school administrator. The concepts of unwanted touching, lack of consent, and potential harassment would immediately flag it as completely unacceptable behavior, requiring intervention and education. Do you remember playing kiss chase, and how did it make you feel? Number 4, Lamppost. Here's a game that combined the thrill of blindness with the excitement of traffic. Lamppost was essentially Russian roulette for children. One child would stand with their eyes closed while others attempted to cross busy roads, moving forward only when specific commands were called out. The basic rules were terrifyingly simple. The caller would shout, "Lamppost," and players could move one body length forward. Other commands had different meanings, though the exact rules varied by region and decade. The goal was to cross the road and back without being caught moving at the wrong time, or, more importantly, without being hit by a car. What made this game particularly dangerous was its urban setting. This wasn't played in quiet residential streets, but often on main roads with regular traffic. Children would time their movements between cars, relying on the caller's commands and their own judgment about when it was safe to move. The psychological element was intense. Standing in the middle of a road with your eyes closed, listening for the next command while cars passed nearby, required nerves of steel. The temptation to peek or move at the wrong time was enormous, but getting caught meant starting over. Parents and teachers seemed remarkably unaware of this game, probably because it was played away from schools and homes, in the anonymous spaces where children created their own entertainment. The lack of adult supervision was part of the appeal. Modern traffic levels and safety awareness make Lamppost unthinkable today. The very idea of children playing games involving roads would trigger immediate intervention from any responsible adult. Did you ever play road-based games, and how did you avoid getting caught? Number 5. Romans versus Britons. Imagine explaining to modern parents that their children spent break time reenacting ancient warfare with real physical combat. Romans versus Britons turned school playgrounds into battlefields, complete with charging armies, defensive lines, and the kind of collisions that would make rugby players wince. The setup was beautifully simple and utterly chaotic. The Roman team would form a defensive line at the top of concrete steps, usually in a school porch or raised area. The Britons would gather at the bottom, then charge up the steps en masse, trying to break through the Roman line and reach the fortress behind. What made this game particularly intense was the genuine historical context children brought to it. This wasn't just random playground violence, it was educational warfare. Children would discuss tactics, historical accuracy, and the relative merits of Roman discipline versus British courage while planning their attacks. The physical reality was considerably more brutal than the educational theory. 30 children charging up concrete steps into a human wall created spectacular collisions. The Romans had the advantage of height and defensive position, but the Britons had momentum and numbers. The result was controlled chaos that somehow rarely resulted in serious consequences. Teachers seemed to view this as acceptable because of its historical educational value. Learning about ancient Britain through physical reenactment was considered more engaging than textbook study, even if it involved children essentially fighting each other on concrete surfaces. The game required genuine courage from both sides. Romans had to hold their line against a charging mob, while Britons had to run uphill into a wall of defenders. Success was measured not just in victory, but in how bravely you played your historical role. Which side did you prefer, the disciplined Romans or the brave Britons? Number 6. Egg, butter, sugar, tea, fairy on the Christmas tree. Here's a game so bizarre and dangerous that most people who didn't play it assume you're making it up. Egg, butter, sugar, tea, fairy on the Christmas tree was a playground ritual that combined elements of choice, violence, and theatrical performance in ways that would horrify modern child psychologists. The setup was deceptively simple. All players except one would stand on a bench or raised surface. The remaining player would go down the line, and each person would choose one of the 5 options. Each choice determined how violently they would be pulled from the bench onto the concrete below. Egg was the most dangerous option, being grabbed by the knees and yanked backward off the bench. Butter involved being pulled off by one hand as forcefully as possible. Sugar was a 2-handed pull. Tea had its own method that varied by region. Fairy on the Christmas tree was the safest option, a piggyback ride followed by being spun and gently lowered to the ground. The psychological element was crucial. Choosing egg marked you as brave but reckless. Choosing fairy was safe but carried social consequences. You'd be labeled cautious or worse. The game created a hierarchy of courage that extended far beyond the playground. Once everyone was on the ground in whatever position they'd landed, the puller would go around and tell each person what their contorted shape looked like, and they'd have to act it out. This theatrical element transformed potential embarrassment into entertainment. The game's combination of physical danger, social pressure, and creative performance made it uniquely compelling. It was simultaneously a test of courage, a social ritual, and an improvisational theater exercise. If you played this game, which option did you usually choose, and why? Number 7. Tiggy off ground. Take the simple concept of tag, add the requirement that safety could only be found at dangerous heights, and you have Tiggy off ground, a game that turned every playground into a vertical assault course. The rules were simple. You couldn't be caught if you weren't touching the ground, which meant climbing anything and everything to escape being it. What made this game particularly hazardous was the creative interpretation of off-ground. Children would climb playground equipment far beyond its intended use, scale walls and fences, hang from tree branches, and balance on narrow ledges, all to avoid being tagged. The higher and more precarious your position, the safer you were from the chaser. The playground equipment of the 1960s and 70s was perfectly designed for this kind of dangerous play. Metal climbing frames reached impressive heights, slides had tall platforms, and everything was built over concrete or tarmac. Modern safety surfaces and height restrictions would have completely changed the game's dynamics. Trees were the ultimate refuge, but also the most dangerous. Children would climb to genuinely unsafe heights, often over hard surfaces, with no safety equipment or adult supervision. The combination of adrenaline, competition, and peer pressure led to some spectacular climbing achievements and equally spectacular falls. The psychological element was intense too. Being chased while trying to climb created a genuine fight-or-flight response. The fear of being caught competed with the fear of falling, creating split-second decisions about risk that no adult would want children making. Teachers generally tolerated Tiggy off ground because it encouraged physical activity and creative problem-solving. The occasional tumble was seen as part of learning about personal limits and risk assessment. What was the highest or most dangerous place you climbed during Tiggy-Off Ground? Number 8. Pile On. Some games are subtle in their danger. Pile On was not one of them. This was a game where the entire point was for as many children as possible to jump on top of one unfortunate individual at the bottom of the pile. What could possibly go wrong? The game usually started spontaneously when someone fell over or was tackled during another activity. Instead of helping them up, other children would see an opportunity and shout, "Pile on!" This was the signal for everyone within hearing distance to run over and jump on the growing heap of bodies. The person at the bottom faced genuine risks from the weight of multiple children pressing down on them. Breathing became difficult, movement was impossible, and the pressure could be genuinely dangerous. Yet somehow, being chosen as the foundation of a pile was often seen as a mark of popularity rather than victimization. What made Pile On particularly chaotic was its spontaneous nature. Unlike organized games with clear rules, this could happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone. A simple trip in the playground could suddenly become a mass participation event with no warning or preparation. The social dynamics were complex too. Some children actively sought to be the center of a pile, enjoying the attention and physical contact. Others dreaded it but couldn't escape once it started. The game created temporary hierarchies based on who was brave enough to be at the bottom and who was quick enough to join the pile. Teachers had mixed reactions to Pile On. Some saw it as harmless rough play that built resilience and social bonds. Others recognized the genuine risks and tried to discourage it, though enforcement was difficult given its spontaneous nature. Were you ever at the bottom of a Pile On, and how did it feel? Number 9. Kick the can. Take hide and seek, add a metal projectile, and place it on concrete surfaces with minimal supervision. Welcome to Kick the Can, a game that combined the thrill of hiding with the satisfaction of violent impact. This wasn't just about finding people. It was about the spectacular finale when someone emerged from hiding to attack an inanimate object with maximum force. The basic premise was simple enough. One person guarded a can while others hid. The hidden players had to sneak back and kick the can without being caught, but the execution was considerably more dangerous than the concept suggested, particularly given the equipment and surfaces involved. The cans were usually metal, old food tins, paint cans, or whatever could be found in the playground. These weren't soft, child-friendly objects, but genuine metal containers with sharp edges and considerable weight. When kicked with full force by running children, they became projectiles capable of causing real harm. The playing surfaces made everything worse. Concrete playgrounds meant that missed kicks could result in serious impacts with hard surfaces. The cans would ricochet unpredictably, often hitting other children or bouncing back at the kicker. The combination of metal objects, hard surfaces, and excited children created numerous opportunities for accidents. What made the game particularly intense was the element of surprise. Players would hide for long periods, building up tension and adrenaline before making dramatic dashes toward the can. The explosive release of energy often resulted in kicks that were far more violent than necessary for the game's objectives. The competitive element escalated the violence too. Successfully kicking the can wasn't enough. It had to be kicked with style, distance, and maximum impact to earn playground respect. What's the most memorable can-kicking moment you witnessed or participated in? Number 10. Conker Wars. We've already covered traditional conkers, but Conker Wars was something entirely different. The weaponization of horse chestnuts for direct combat rather than the civilized destruction of each other's conkers. This was conkers without rules, safety, or the pretense of being a traditional game. Instead of taking turns to hit each other's conkers, Conker Wars involved using your hardened horse chestnut as a projectile weapon. Children would swing their conkers at opponents' heads, bodies, and hands, aiming to cause maximum impact rather than destroy the opposing conker. It was essentially medieval warfare with natural ammunition.
The preparation was identical to traditional conkers, baking, soaking, and hardening, but the application was far more aggressive. A well-prepared conker could leave genuine marks when swung with force, and the string allowed for considerable reach and momentum. What made conker wars particularly dangerous was the targeting. Unlike traditional conkers where you aimed at the opponent's conker, this version encouraged aiming at the person. Heads were popular targets, as were hands and arms. The goal was to inflict enough discomfort to make your opponent surrender.
The game often emerged from traditional conker matches that had gone wrong or become too heated. What started as civilized conker destruction would escalate into direct combat, with children using their weapons against each other rather than each other's conkers. Teachers were generally unaware that conker wars existed as a separate activity from traditional conkers. The equipment was identical, so it appeared that children were playing the approved traditional game when they were actually engaged in something far more aggressive. The social dynamics were intense too. Conker wars required genuine courage because you knew you were going to get hit. Unlike traditional conkers where skill mattered most, this version rewarded aggression and pain tolerance. The children who could take hits without flinching earned considerable playground respect. The end of conker wars usually came when someone got hurt badly enough to cry, or when a teacher noticed that children were targeting each other rather than each other's conkers. But by then, the damage was often done, and the game would simply move to a different location. Did traditional conker games ever escalate into something more aggressive at your school? These weren't just games. They were rites of passage that taught children about courage, risk, and consequences in ways that no amount of supervised activities could match. We learned to assess danger, push our limits, and accept the results of our choices through direct experience rather than theoretical instruction. Some of these games disappeared because they were genuinely too dangerous for modern sensibilities. Others vanished because we've created a world where children's play is constantly supervised, regulated, and sanitized. We've gained safety, but lost the raw excitement that made childhood feel like an adventure. The playgrounds that once echoed with the sounds of British Bulldog and Romans versus Britons are now filled with approved activities, safety surfaces, and risk assessments. Children are safer, but they're also missing out on the kind of experiences that shaped entire generations. Which of these games do you remember most vividly? And would you let your own children play them today? Share your playground war stories in the comments below.